what we want to do in this last session of the day, I guess, we've mentioned today that the task forces are the important outcomes from our Queensland New Zealand summit. I think Richard was a bit too pro-New Zealand in his speech earlier, but managed to leave rugby out of it, which was nice for a change. This is an example, I guess, of where in the six and a bit months now that I've been in my role with Smart City Council, where everyone in the world is seeing the value in what we do, and it's really important for us to double down on that. There's lots of talk that goes on, there's lots of blogging that goes on these days, but if we're not creating, if we're not turning your sketches, Noel, into buildings that people dwell in and have a better wellbeing outcome and a better environmental outcome, then we're not really contributing to much at all. And so if you go back about a year, this is something that now we've picked up by, I'll move to that in a second. What we do now as an organisation constantly is remind ourselves things that, again, were touched on stage. What are the values that drive us to do anything at all, to get up and design a building, to create a new financial model or instrument? And in a world where a lot of people in our area of thinking and influence are very doubled down on technology and data being everything, it's not of any use at all to us unless in the initial discussion people in place are the objective of everything we do. So technology, we talked a bit before about ethics, and I've mentioned with AI at the moment, Richard, you talked a lot about ChatGPT and it's sort of come into that public domain, but when Oppenheimer created nuclear fusion, everyone realised very quickly that was a whole lot bigger than we ever could have imagined it being, right? Something that started out in an experimental phase, we needed to stop, and it took 24 years till we had the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, right? It took us that long to grasp with the magnitude of that technology. Then, Richard, you mentioned mapping the human genome, and suddenly you could clone your children and have cloned organs, and society again had to stop and take a breath and say, we know what we can do, but what should we do? And I think we're getting to a point like that at the moment with artificial intelligence, where there's going to be that pause and hold moment and think. And something we'll be talking about a lot more as an organisation is ethics around data and AI as we go forward. And so understanding and having your values as a talisman or a touchstone for everything that you do fundamentally drives our organisation. Now, people in our organisation very clearly understand if something sits inside or outside of, I guess you would say, our code of ethics. That's something else that you'll see pretty soon. So to distinguish between mission and vision, we don't have a focus as an organisation actually on tech and data. We have a focus on making a better world for people and all of our other species to live in. And at the moment, technology and data, as we've talked about earlier, is a very powerful tool to help us do that. But we're primarily focused on people in place, and something that came up in your discussion, again, Noel, was local action and global impact, which is another byline for our organisation. And none of this stuff's very new. We sit happily and comfortable in the midst of public sector, private sector, academia, and increasingly charity, philanthropy and NGOs. We're talking about that $1 trillion deficit we're trying to cut. There are a lot of high net worth people, as you know, out there who are actively wanting to contribute to that. And we have some projects even at the moment coming out of task forces where private foundations and high net worth people want to fund the entire program or trial. So we're becoming happily a really good touch point for that. And something I'll mention quickly that goes back to values, but since we've launched our global charity partnership initiative around Smart Cities Council, what we've started to see is this virtuous cycle. For example, that one charity we work with, EB Research Partnership in New York, the people that donate to that charity also invest in member groups and want to invest in sustainability and other initiatives around the world. So building that type of collaboration and building capability and capacity is how we make change. So, to a point, and this is Mr. Finn's image, Richard, but the impact model that I love. This is, I think, the most simplistic and eloquent model that you could ever have. If you make an impact, you're relevant, and you'll create value on the way through. So we're really focused on this action and outcome, and this is an example of what we're doing. I'll introduce, before we get going in earnest, Harvey Marcus from Azun, which is IT cyber Italian company. Harvey's a tragic Manchester City guy, unfortunately, who arrived in Australia because the weather there is so horrible. It doesn't even have to rain for you to get soaking wet. I was there. Our office in the UK is in Manchester, and I had the misfortune of spending 2 days there, Harvey, and now I know why you live here. Apart from the ivy, I think it's got nothing going for it at all, Manchester. And Richard and Noel, you've met before. This is an example where there's a real world challenge and opportunity. So Airports Council International represents, I think, 1,975 of the biggest airports in the world, and approached us and TM Forum, who are the big telco industry group, and Digital Twin Consortium, and said, we're actually really shit at airports. We want to be better. And that the first thing that's good about that is there's a sense of acknowledgement. The second thing is that organisations like ours are positioned well to start that conversation, because there isn't this perceived, I guess, how would you say, adversarial interface with industry. So the five of us ended up getting together. So we've got a guy, Dan Isaacs, who's a very clever guy out of Digital Twin Consortium. Shagan, who represents Airports Council International and the other 1,975 airports that want a standardised, data-driven, technology-enabled airport. This is just how it all started. You go to Schiphol and wait 2 hours in security, and it sends you mad. And when they rang and asked me to be on it, I'd just been in 34 countries in 14 weeks, and I said, anything I can do to make airports work better, I'll do for free. Just where do I start? So poor old Mark Munro in the middle there from Vantic, they're an artificial intelligence company. He'd just been arrested for drink driving by the look of that photo. Isaac's French, which explains his face, and I think I'd been out late the night before my picture got taken. But Shagan is, as I said, represents nearly 2,000 airports, and what you see here now is operating in Heathrow, speaking to collaboration, where there's nearly 2,000 other airports that can pick this up now as a model, with a playbook, with a set of tools and educational and training assets and innovative contracts and design templates and a curated ethical vendor ecosystem to start that journey, which we'll speak to in a minute. At the end of this, I'll sort of, as I say, pick up where we are today, but this was a paper that we presented, or an extract of it, in Barcelona in January at the IoT Solutions World Congress. It's since been well received in Orlando, where Isaac and I managed to get there the very next day, somehow, from Barcelona to do that, and also in Warsaw and in Istanbul. So there's a lot of global support behind it. This is also a really important part of where we sit as an organisation around collaboration. We don't want to own the process of making a better world for people. There's a whole lot of people who touch this as a challenge, with a lot of stakeholders and a lot of information and knowledge that we want to bring together. So we want to democratise all of the IP we create. We're not a private sector organisation that wants to keep our secret herbs and spices to ourselves and sell as much chicken as we can. What we want to do is create good outcomes for people in place that can be iterated, scaled and replicated to deliver a better world. So if we start with the challenge of airports, if you start with the challenge of anything from a commercial exercise, probably even Noel, people will talk to architects about this, but people normally, they want to make money, save money, reduce risk and deliver ESG benefits, better wellbeing for people, staff, environment, water, waste and so on. What we need to do is probably get that fourth one a bit further up the ladder and contemplate business cases in a slightly different way. But the tipping point when we talk about technology driven into this is to move away from that traditional view of data at state and to start to look at event-driven assessments of data when things change, and what we're calling here, or Gartner have called, and what's more regularly adopted now as decision prioritisation. The other thing that we've got to do, and we've seen a lot of projects go not in a perfect direction because the use case of the client had to adapt to the available technology rather than the technologies being developed, being customised to the use case. And that's another really important part of what we want to do as an organisation. We know that the private sector in IoT and smart cities is investing literally hundreds of billions of dollars, and it's logical that if you are investing that much money, you want to align it to a market at the end of the day, and it's logical if you're a government then you want better outcomes, or a client that you want to share what your key drivers are in order to have the market better respond to your needs. So that's another fundamentally important sort of tipping point as technology comes into the solving of a problem. So the problem that we ultimately scoped out as a group was initially, and it's actually a narrow part of a bigger problem, and Richard, you alluded to going from one person to every person on an entire planet. We started just by mapping the passenger experience. And I don't think there would be anyone in the room who hasn't caught a plane. So I did meet a lady in Frankfurt recently who was 75 catching her first plane and didn't understand even you had to check in. She was totally overwhelmed trying to get through immigration with someone pointing a gun at her. So this journey we're all familiar with, and we know all the pain points of that journey. But as I said before, what are we trying to do? We want to increase safety, reduce risk, reduce delays. Reducing delays improves passenger and staff well-being, because that's another tension point. And when we looked at this, interestingly, we looked at people's physical journey, their digital journey, and their emotional journey, which goes back to some of the other discussions that we had earlier. If people aren't spending 2 hours in a queue and they're sitting in a restaurant having lunch or buying presents for their family in a shop, it's good for the passenger, obviously, and it's good for the economic activation of the airport. And then how can we look at other aspects like logically reducing operating costs if we can, and sustainability there. So this was the focus of this multi-consortia initiative. The next thing is, how do you standardise all of that? Because every country is a bit different, and as we'd all know, I was in Kuala Lumpur the other day and two backpackers behind me said, why is every airport different? And I said, funny you should say that. But if you go to Singapore, you can be through the gate in the lounge in, I think 3.5 minutes is a record if you're flying with Singapore Airlines. It's so quick. But if you're in Barcelona, it can take 2 hours. If you're in Istanbul, it can take days. It's just... So the first thing is, and Richard could talk forever on semantic modelling, and perhaps, Richard, just for a moment, it would be good for you to talk about this, because this is a fundamental first step when you can talk about an airline, you can talk about a flight number, you can talk about an aeroplane. There's different words that different people within an ecosystem will use. So if you want to bring all of that information together to be able to model and analyse it, it's a very complex process to build this semantic model. And the first thing we've got to do with Airports Council and ACRIS, which is their standards committee, is build that semantic model that everybody can reference with common meaning. So that in and of itself is a significant exercise, which happily Shagan, as a dyed-in-the-wool data scientist, has been ably leading. But you've been involved in this sort of process, Richard.
Yes, it's developing ontologies for these sorts of applications uses. I mean, there's been the Urban Ontology project that was led by the University of Melbourne in Australia. Atlas Rajapathan was leading that one. But again, there's all sorts of different ontology projects. But when you start to bring across all these things, you want to deal at the higher level of the integration. It's not data integration, but it's looking at that sort of semantic integration that you're talking about.
Yeah, and something that why I've got Harvey here today is, as we've gone through all of this, I walked out of the presentation in Barcelona that was well received, and I said to everyone on the panel, we haven't once yet talked about cybersecurity. We've got all of these different systems. We've got literally thousands of stakeholders. As people would know, if you travel internationally, you've got to give your personal data 3 times, not once. You've got to give it to the airline, to the airport, and then to the government on the way out. And how can we, if we want to build efficiency, how can we build a secure process that people's information is already known, and that all of that standing in 3 different queues and filling out little forms and getting sniffed by a dog doesn't have to happen anymore. So there is a high level of complexity in just bringing the language of government, the language of airlines, and the language of airports into a common place. And that all revolves around being able to secure that data, because the value is having the data aggravated that you can analyze it and get and it can be causal and reliable. But that also creates a single point of failure. So protecting the edge, we'll talk about in a minute, Harvey, and then protecting data in transit, and then protecting data in storage.
But it's about cybersecurity by design. I think that's the key, and that's what's been missing in the conversation, I think.
Well, I think we're backfilling on cybersecurity, unfortunately, a lot. And another discussion we had earlier, do you want one with a battery, or is your battery working?
No, is it working?
You just use that big Mancunian voice of yours.
Hello.
What we don't want to be doing, and a really fundamental aspect of this standardisation is, and we saw with the proliferation of the internet, suddenly all these laws about cyber stalking, dark web, people posting images of people that they didn't want to post. There was no legislation, there was no framework around any of that. And what we can't afford to have happen in a process like this, or the process of what we're talking about here happening at scale and with artificial intelligence, we need regulatory and legislative frameworks around that. And we also need a risk environment that mitigates those exposures. So this is an example of the different sort of events now that we started to bring in. And as I said, this is now a living project at Heathrow that Shegun's kindly implemented there, that we continue to iterate. The service providers are listed to that project, but what's important about this as well, and our positioning from the start, was you want a vibrant multi-vendor ecosystem that you can build your own best journey with. And that was a fundamental initial positioning that we had with Airports Council International and the other collaborators. This is a really interesting model coming out
The modern airport
with a bit of voiceover, so I'll shut up for a minute.
Composable digital services and a standard data architecture that enables interoperability between the many different domains present by combining IoT, AI, 5G, and edge computing with a digital twin of the airport. You can introduce real-time intelligence to the way passengers, security, baggage, retail, and facility operations are all working together in a system of systems. There are two elements required to make this happen. One, the move from batch-based data to real-time event data that enables asynchronous communication and loose coupling between the systems. And two, a digital twin that can provide real-time insights to test and optimize performance, predict and prevent issues, as well as make data-driven decisions for smart airport operations. The digital twin model of the airport can be rapidly instantiated by a standard schema defining the type and location of static objects in the space. Next, the digital twin can be connected to the physical world by ingesting real-time events. Baggage handling systems can easily communicate with flight planning systems to ensure that bags are located onto the correct flight. When sensor equipment indicates an alarm, the real-time stream updates the digital twin to reflect the issue and alerts and triages staff to the location. Passengers also benefit as it allows for the seamless exchange of information between systems, such as check-in, security, and boarding, improving the overall passenger experience. The twin keeps track of line length and wait times, which can be configured to allocate appropriate personnel when defined thresholds are exceeded, so that new lanes can be opened to provide a smoother airport experience. To connect the digital twin model to real-time event data, the backend was developed using Vantic's low-code platform, designed to easily compose and orchestrate real-time events. Here, we see Vantic's low-code environment receiving and processing atomic events from sources and validating that the stream meets all the criteria defined in the ontology, including standard concepts, entities, and values. Additionally, the low-code event-driven approach allows for discrete use cases to be dynamically added over time. This can serve as the foundation for rapid implementation of various smart airport use cases in a composable and interoperable model.
So what's interesting about all of that is with a digital twin now, everyone's very topical digital twins, and there are a lot of applications. With an event-driven system like this now, you can not only performance optimize the performance of an existing asset, but then you can use all of the rich data streams from that asset to then model a future change to that asset. So something that we're going to look at more when I brought the safety into the discussion is there are a lot of assumptions, for example, made about human behaviour in civil defence, terrorism or fire events. Normally, as Noel would attest, a fire safety engineer will need to come up with a deemed to satisfy provision with an absolute safe evacuation time, a required safe evacuation time. And that involves some very, very clunky old software at best, or somebody's sort of doing that and being prepared to pay a big insurance premium and sign it off. So all of a sudden you can model infinite different scenarios about a fire event of a certain size or a certain level of spread, or if fire doors are left open, or if you want to remove stairwells. So if you think Noel, imagine if you can double the distance between fire stairwells, for example, by helping people have better information, dynamic wayfinding. Imagine you can do the same with cleaning. I got involved in my former professional life with a hospital, and we worked out if you could get people to make better decisions, tradespeople, and walk at 3 kilometres an hour instead of 1.5, you'd save $200 million a year of walking, because they're all charging by the hour and going around fixing a light point, checking a tap, checking a circuit breaker. So the value that you can create here in terms of designing an efficient asset as well, outside of those really tangible ones of just getting the existing people on an existing model to spend more money, it comes back to that idea of having a different business model. So then we go from artificial intelligence to decision intelligence.
We would like to show how airport foot traffic data can be visualized in Delmia Operations Experience. This demo can be implemented for the entire airport, but in this specific example we look into a specific retail area within domestic airport. Here we are assuming we have few foot traffic sensors in this area. For each area we measure the foot traffic in 4 different categories: quiet, moderate, busy and very busy. In Delmia Operations Experience, we can replay the foot traffic measurement for this area for any time interval in the past. In this example, we are looking at snapshots of sensor data at 15 minutes intervals from 1 p.m. to 12 a.m. We can see here the foot traffic starts to increase from 3 p.m. in the evening and peak around 6:30 to 7 p.m. Then it starts to quiet down. We can notice not all areas get busy at the same time, and some places were more busy than others. Delmia Operations Experience provides for the visualization of collection of operation data from many different sources within the context of digital twin of the operational environment.
So importantly, you can see that helps us understand an asset as it's designed and in use. It can also help us optimize the way that asset's used. It can help people determine when to clean toilets, when to clean floors. The thing that struck me when I first saw that is the areas where people don't go. I know from having worked for 30 years in architectural and engineering design, there are a lot of assumptions about the decisions people make and the way they move that suddenly we can validate or disprove or at least learn and optimize. So we've got now a solution on a digital twin platform that can at once learn and teach itself to be more efficient and teach us to be more efficient, and at the same time inform future changes to that asset or how to design similar assets for the future. I think I've gone the wrong way, sorry. This is just a little bit of the process around that, which I think most people in the room will understand, building out the systems of systems approach. So this was another fundamentally important part, which is to get from networked to or a system approach to a system of systems approach, where all of these things can come together in one place, which is where this value comes from. I guess, Harvey, coming back to what you were saying earlier, when you start to bring together lots of sensitive personal information, passport numbers, payment details from multiple different areas, how do you, when you come to a process like that, want to view the, as I said, the management of data? Because first you've got to convince people to even let you do it, and normally people don't want to share. What's the process and approach, which is coming up in the next stage of this project, that you would see as being fundamentally important to the successful lobbying of stakeholders and then execution and then through like management of this level of highly sensitive information?
Well, let me start with a question. Is this working?
You are.
Okay. Do people know what the average dwelling duration of malware is in an IT system before it's spotted?
That one's a weekend. Hold it close to the.
So repeat the question. Does anybody know what the average duration malware sits undetected in an IT system? Anyone want to venture a guess?
How long do IT systems last?
Sir?
How long do IT systems last?
I'll answer the question. The average is 300 days. So the point is, if we're not designing cybersecurity right through the process, from data storage to data movement to data interrogation, you're not going to have a chance of preventing it, number one. Number two, if there is an intrusion at any stage in that, then you're not going to spot it. And that's only talking about IT systems. In a lot of this conversation, we're talking about OT systems, i.e. machine to machine, where there's no human intervention. An example was in the United States last year. One of the highly publicized examples was there was a process interfered with that was going to affect the fluoride level and the chemical, and I'm no chemical expert, in the water supply. It would have actually had serious health consequences. It was only spotted because a human being walked past a computer and saw something moving without anybody operating it, and then raised the alarm. If that person hadn't raised the alarm, unless it had been stopped by a further fail-safe check, it would have gone through. Now, it sounds like I'm in the fear business. It's kind of a bit like terrorism. You know, a cybersecurity attacker only has to be successful once, like a terrorist. So, with all due respect to the climate change discussion earlier, absolutely, climate change is having an impact. That impact will get worse, but it's still very much geographically determined to a large extent as to that impact. Cybersecurity can strike anywhere in terms of an attack at any time. And so to answer your question specifically, you have to do it by design in the process. You have to look at every element in that flowchart, from where you're going to store the data. You know, sometimes people say, oh, well, it's in the cloud. My cloud provider takes care of it. Well, your cloud provider takes care of it to a very large extent when it's in the cloud, but even cloud providers here will tell you it's still got to come off the cloud, it's still got to go into your systems, out of your systems. So you need to be looking at cybersecurity by design, whether that's in your IT systems, i.e. the systems that you run your business with and contact your customers with and suppliers, and your OT systems, which are machine to machine. Fortunately, there are companies like us, Azun, out of Turin in Italy, that can help you on that journey.
Are you seeing still, Harvey, there's a sense when I talk to cities all over the place, and even in this airport discussion, that somehow there's a magic bullet for cybersecurity, and if you just pay enough money to a certain vendor, it solves your problem. But the data we're seeing is that still nearly 70% of cyber breaches are human enabled. So obviously getting the right processes into something like this is going to be fundamental to in even enabling this project. I again, before being in this role, was advising governments around smart cities, and so many projects were on hold simply because either they couldn't get enough level of comfort around the cyber risk, or the other one was typically no one knew how to buy it because governments aren't set up with innovative procurement strategies to be able to deal with this. So in terms of designing a process and then putting tools into it, that's going to be, and then constantly iterating, because every day of the week there's a new type of threat.
Absolutely, and so large companies that are well funded and governments sometimes think, careful I say this, going to a top tier consultancy company is going to solve it all for them because you can put the report up at the board and it's been done by that consultant. But I would say context is important. So a company like ours, for example, one of the reasons we're involved, we also play in that smart city space, particularly out of Italy and Europe. So it's having somebody that can help you on the journey that has the context to what you're trying to achieve, as well as the processes, knowledge, tools, and the outcomes that you're trying to get to. There is no magic bullet, and nobody's got the solution to everybody. So the other thing that's important is collaboration and dealing with organizations that know what they're good at and know what they're not best at and can involve other third parties.
A question. was in the press the other day that the US model of there's a proposal that software companies have to provide the cybersecurity within their programs, and that Australia was going to be adopting that same model here. Is that even possible for to make it 100% secure through integrating it into the software itself?
Well, the simple answer to 100% is no.
What is it? Or a percent that might?
Yeah, I think, I think by design, again, you can get a high probability for sure. Now, you've got to weigh up, I guess, the investment in doing that versus the risk. And if you do it in the software only, the software is only part of the overall thing. What Corey's driving is it's only part of the whole cycle. So you've got to have that cybersecurity by design right across that process. So starting with the business outcome, okay, what is it you want the data to do, or what do you want the communication from machine to machine to do? So looking at it from an outcome first, and then working it back through the process, including the software that you're going to use.
The point about, and again, why we're wanting to broaden the types of people in this room. We talked before about financiers, insurance companies, lawyers. I sit on, I think, 5 different boards. One's a charity, one's a sports organisation, 3 are tech, 2 tech and a movie company. And every month you report risk at a board level, right? And you look at it and ultimately you say, how much money does it, or human life or cost is it, and what is the cost to mitigate that? And you live and create a risk matrix and operate within that. Now, obviously, big companies have got more money, and they'll, the risk level will need to be higher. But that's ultimately, at the moment, at least, the way organisationally we look at things. Obviously, any injury to staff or public or loss of life is the highest priority as a director. And then you've got an obligation to protect all of the other assets of the company, including money. But it's about, again, changing the way of thinking about how we even develop a risk matrix, understanding different levels of risk, and that we can consider them more innovatively is a really important part.
But one thing I would say, in the same way that all of us who've seen e-commerce spread, 10, 15 years ago, it started with the large companies, and then they started mandating that everybody in the supply chain met a certain requirement. We will see that now from a cybersecurity point of view. So you might be sitting here as a small business saying, I don't have the resources, I don't have the same problem, but you might be the gateway into a government or large entity, and you'll find that to do business with corporate Australia and government, you're going to be mandated to have a certain cyber risk profile, certain basic credentials, maybe the Essential 8, for example, if anybody's not familiar with that language, which is one of the areas, or NIST, or even ISO across business. You'll find that you'll need one of those sort of frameworks and a way of reporting on it to do business at the big end of town.
Seeing government won't let people tender. You've got to have a certain level of assets, and you've got to have a certain series of processes and quality assurance, or you can't play. So what we've seen so far with this digital twin-enabled system of systems meta model that we've built is that we can understand now what our assets are doing and how they're performing, and we can make changes to air conditioning. We can automate fire safety reporting, which means less time on site, which means less cost. It means less interference with user groups, less security risk with people coming and going from site. The next thing that we can do is model for the future. And Richard, you've been talking about vertiports. This is some work we're doing with Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, which is exactly modelling the introduction of vertiports to their airport now. And this work's ongoing, and I think would be tremendously interesting here to the city of Brisbane and others, where this technology is imminent. So, and again, all this information, I'm eternally grateful to the industry groups we work with and our partners. Dassault could keep this as their IP. They're not. The initiative of this project is to democratise all of this knowledge and information, to have tools where you can take an AWS platform or any other platform and start to build to an agreed playbook with an agreed set of standards, and with all the right tools and educational assets, your new greenfield airport, a vertiport into your airport, understand what it looks like to integrate freight into that process, not just people. What other systems and information do I need to do that reliably? How do I performance optimize it? And One other discussion we've started to have, we're talking about AI and we're talking about machine learning, which is, moving from network to smart to intelligent in terms of the language that we use. But we're getting to a point of machine teaching, because if we get this right, any airport, or let's call it transportation hub, because there's been a high demand for us to move from airports into rail, seaports, and road transport. Imagine if you're born as a new airport and you speak every language that there's ever been, every physical equation there ever was, all the rules of structural engineering and science and everything, and you have all the collective experience of every other airport that there ever was, as an example. So then you discover one mistake or one error or one glitch, and you can immediately let all of those other transportation hubs learn from that error that they never have to make it. So you've got a connected intelligence. So the concept of machine teaching is becoming even a reality. So we've got assets now that can be the best form of themselves, that they can give guys like Noel feedback and information about the true performance of human behaviour in that asset compared with the assumed performance. And they can tune themselves, at the point, Noel, when you're conceiving of a building, this sort of information can help you design buildings, 30 or 40% potentially more cost effectively. You can performance optimize the use of space. You can minimize systems, and then through life, the human interventive requirement. To give you an idea about what you can do with automation, the building I talked about before with the $200 million of cost saving, they have 18,000 of these little residual current devices that if they go over 6 milliamps, you need to replace them. They each need to be tested manually every 6 months. So someone walks around and sticks in a probe and tests these things. On average, 20 a year fail. So if you imagine the cost of paying someone to go to 36,000 times and conduct a manual test, to knowing in advance which 20 are faulty and just going there and fixing them, the opportunity cost is enormous. But now we can also take all of the information we have and help design new features, as you said, Richard. We're not talking about an iteration of an airport. Vertiports are a whole new form of modality and form of connectivity. And obviously there's a lot of assumptions made around that. But with this sort of modelling on real, valid and reliable and actionable data, then we can make sure to the extent possible that we're successful. So what do you see as being the key points around that?
Well, probably a key thing is that, vertiport, when you talk about evolution, Darwin spoke about evolution as being a slow and gradual process, and then you've got the neo-Darwinists talking about punctuated equilibrium points. And so evolution is actually quite violent, and it has these big disruptive changes. And when you think about vertiports, they're not just it's very soft, they're not a soft evolution from the airports we have today or from the heliports, but they're going to be a whole total new sort of concept, if you like, from urban air mobility on demand, and they'll be integrated in with existing sort of more traditional transport hubs. And again, there's going to be other sort of challenges in the sense that they're not going to be petrol based and fuel based. They're going to be reliant upon electricity, and where does that come from? How do you sustain that sort of demands that these things have? And also, with respect to the type of very much on demand sort of short runs of these types of EV tolls will be there. But also coming back to sort of trying to look at where things are going into the future, it's always looking at where the things have come from the past, and just listening to what Corey's been saying with those things there. If you go back to the 17th or probably the 18th century, a place called Königsberg, it's now in Russia. It's got another name, I can't remember what it is, but it's sort of small place. But there were three great mines that came from Königsberg in the 18th century, early 19th century. One of them was Immanuel Kant. It's Kant with a K-A-N-T. And again, sort of his ideas have led to the virtualization sort of way that we look at things today. I mean, this is way beyond sort of when he lived. We've got this. The other one is Kirchhoff, who you probably know from school days with the Kirchhoff's law. And so again, sort of looking at that whole management of a topology, because when you're looking at a digital twin, it's a digital twin of a geometry is one aspect, but a digital twin of a topology is a whole lot more value. And again, these different systems that Corey's talking about here, and systems of systems, these are topological models that are there. So again, with what came out of Kirchhoff was the sort of ideas of dynamic programming and a whole of other things which are enablers today. This is absolutely sort of state-of-the-art sort of ways of, there's a couple of data scientists in the room and they'll know what I'm talking about with that. And the other one, which is probably the most famous of those names, or at least he's my hero anyway, I should have a poster of it more, is Euler. And Euler was famous for the Königsberg's bridge problem. I can't remember how many bridges, 7 bridges, and
7 bridges, yeah.
crossing those bridges there. And out of Euler's work came the sort of graph theory. And I've had a campaign while my son was at school, he's now at university, but I was going to every maths teacher and say, thou shalt teach my son graph theory at school. It's crazy that you learn it in third year university and things like that. It should be something that's taught in schools, because with graph theory, you can solve the Rubik's Cube, you can do all this other thing. In fact, we were talking before, ontologies are built upon graph knowledge, with RDF graphs and things like that. When you look at the Chat GPT, that's built upon graphs. And when you start looking at digital twin, I mean, a digital twin is really, it's like, we've talked before about cryptocurrencies. What cryptocurrency is to blockchain is like a digital twin is to a digital thread. And so a cryptocurrency deals with a 0-dimensional asset, whereas a digital twin will deal with a multi-dimensional asset. And so then we say, well, what is this digital thread? It could be a blockchain, but it's probably going to be looking at a directed acyclic graph, which goes back to Euler's sort of work and things like that. And so these are things that are so relevant and so contemporary as ideas, but they're things that have been around for a couple of centuries, and they're just sort of ready, waiting for the latent time just to suddenly become relevant to today. And I think it's super exciting. And so just looking forward, we look at the past and sort of go forward. So I hope that answers your question.
No, that's good. I really appreciate it. So we've landed at a point now where, as I said, we've got a model and a tool that is working, that is iterative, as it's written here, scalable and replicable. And now it's been quite extraordinary. Tomorrow I'll be with some of our team members in San Francisco picking up on this, and next week presenting a version of this paper at the press club at the White House. The value around what we're talking about, as I've written here, is this is an actual transformational use case. You said, Richard, at the start of the day, what we need is use cases. I think for a while, digital twins, people have talked about them and said they're really cool and you can do lots of things with them, but not a lot of things were being done with them. And what we're trying to do, as I said, as an organisation focused on impact, is pick up if Airports Council come to us and say, we have an opportunity, we have a challenge, what can we do? Is build a set of actions that create a self-sustaining positive impact. So our next steps in this process, and I talk about it now leading into the sort of the final discussion, where we want as many people in this room as are willing to be involved, is we want to expand now from just the passenger experience to also the freight experience, because there are many contingency or dependencies in the process for freight as there are for people. We want to extend out from just airports to all transportation hubs, because the templates and canvases that we're building have incredible commonality. By going from a system to a system of systems is really that journey from transport to mobility and actually maturing. So I've written here to saying, I want to get a thing or a person from here to there as efficiently as possible. Or maybe that's not what you're trying to do. Maybe you want to drive along the ocean road and you want to get there as beautifully as possible, but understanding what those experiences might be, we have that ability now by bringing all of these systems together and being able to have event-driven decision making and having rich streams of data that can help Noel design his next airport in a way that, as I said, I worked just before coming into here with the architects of a Harvey Norman complex. And at the very beginning meetings, the amount of assumptions that are made in a store like that about put the white goods here, this many people will come in there, they'll park here, and do you know how many of them just aren't true? It's unbelievable. Once you start to aggregate that data, we are learning so much now out of an asset like that, which again can be used to create a better consumer experience, but also a better staff experience. In that example, just by using human-centric lighting, dwell time went up 23%, spending's gone up 12%, but most importantly, absenteeism has dropped 34%, if you can believe it, by creating a more human environment in which to work and shop. So this is all grist to the mill of an airport process. So the other thing that we're doing from our contribution to this consortium or consortium, depending which country you're in and which school you went to, is going back to people in place, and we're not just about cities and airports and things, but creating those outcomes. So the outputs that we're going to be bringing to this and then roll forward through any of our other task forces, instead of sort of stopping at white papers and saying, don't we know a lot of things, it's building a playbook. How can I start my journey? The reason that we have industry groups is so that people can work on a consolidated basis, share knowledge, share resources, reduce costs, reduce time, reduce risk. That's why these sorts of organisations exist. So coming together with a playbook that 2,000 airports all sign off on is a big achievement. That anyone can start, whatever level of maturity they're on, they have a process to and a clear line of sight to an outcome, not just a whole bunch of high-level thinking. We're going to need educational and training assets, and at Smart Cities Council we have our academy that we're about to make some significant investments into to have targeted, as I said, education around organisational change that will need to go into this. Which jobs do we have that won't exist further? I've seen in the past projects with compelling value propositions. We talked about transport before. They've been quashed, one in the UK, because people are going to lose their jobs if you have driverless trains, for example. So as compelling as it is, stop. What we want to do is identify which jobs people might not have in 5 years' time and start a process of retraining and upskilling people to hopefully more highly qualified and highly paid jobs, so that we can make those steps. Tools that you can, so with Smart City Activator, which is I call it a bit like Jira for smart cities, but it's an ecosystem stakeholder engagement mapping tool with project planning, project management and credentialing. Sorry, there's a typo there, but credentialing aspects to it. That means as a city, you can pick that up again, or an airport or a transport station, say, right, am I government owned or am I private sector owned? Am I domestic, international, or both? What airlines fly into my airport? What planes fly into my airport? What security systems do I have? And you can start to build your own journey very, very quickly, instead of, again, Harvey, to sort of echo your point a little bit, the normal default position is stop, think, and then get one of the big four firms to spend 2 years and several $1 million to give you a report, and then stop again and get one of the biggest design firms in the world to spend a few years on it, and then stop again and give it to one of the biggest builders in the world and let them spend hundreds of millions and billions on it, and then stop again and hand it over to a facility manager who's one of the biggest in the world. And each of those interface points is highly tensioned, it's highly expensive, it's highly emotionally draining for anyone who's ever been in those fights that go for years. So by providing these tools and then having also innovative templates and contract types, because this is a whole new game. We've seen, I guess, to draw on another historic example, I was involved in designing IoT fire and life safety systems for a rail network, government rail network, and the person who was about to spend $4 billion on it was actually the Forestfield Link tunnel in Perth, had just come from procuring grass and then getting paint for toilet blocks, right? So the way that you procure these things can be entirely not fit for purpose, or there's still a whole lot of legislative change that needs to be captured in there, or there are things that don't align. So if you go back to 6 months ago, where industry was saying we've priced 30% of risk into this $200 billion of projects, if as an organisation we can get that down to 10 billion even, we're winning, right? And citizens are getting better outcomes in projects and moving quicker. So through airports, the standardisation standards come through ACRIS, but if we can have also, as I said, known standardised fit-for-purpose contracts, design documents, and then importantly at the end, a curated and ethical and fit-for-purpose vendor ecosystem that can participate in delivering those projects, then as an organisation, we're achieving our mission of delivering a better world and better outcomes for wellbeing for people. We're delivering more efficiency in government by creating capacity building, capability building, and we're creating economic activation in the private sector in a de-risk and positive way. So that's, I guess, picking up on this one task force, how we want to play. As I've said, Harvey, today, there's an important role for your industry to play in the development of the white paper and the playbook, and then obviously the ecosystem to support the delivery of projects. And then if you fast forward to what Richard, you were talking about earlier with smart, safe and sustainable buildings and infrastructure, there's a logical overlap there. And I guess before we just throw to questions, the other thing that I really like about this, and I talked before about federating or democratizing this IP. Next week in the US, we'll have the World Trade Center Lviv team who are part of the Rebuild Ukraine initiative. That, as people know, there's about $1 trillion worth of reconstruction that needs to go on in Ukraine, and they want to collaborate with us on how to standardise that and accelerate that, come up with innovative funding models. They're even talking about, because you're building a new country, using blockchain to actually, and by creating the right economic activation, to distribute dividends to citizens at the end of the year instead of taxing them if they can get this model right. So there's some interesting thinking in the room, but that involves obviously getting the right economic models around it. And with Charter Cities Institute out of Washington, there's 33 greenfield cities in Africa that they're have designed governance and economic modelling for, that they now need a playbook and exactly the same sort of approach. So if you go back to the people in place, positioning and the action and impact, which is where we are, this, I guess, for an end of day is an example of a high value process that we're going through. We'll be very keen to have people in Australia involved in our Australian Airports Task Force. I know Brisbane, Auckland are member airports of that. I know Istanbul Airport's very keen from talking to them a few weeks ago when I was there, and so's Chopin Airport in Warsaw, which actually is not a bad airport, and a few others. And anything we can do to make Petra a better airport would be a great relief to many, many people. So yes, that if we summarise where we've gone through, what we've gone through today as an organisation, sort of presents our positioning and next steps to taking the actions from 6 months ago to continuing to work with government and private sector, and importantly academia. I think what we saw today, for example, about passive aspects of carbon reduction through replacing structural steel with glass fibre polymers and low carbon concrete are also incredibly important part of what we're doing. So as we always say at the end of this, join us. We've got a lot going on. We sort of kicked this off earlier in the year, here today in Washington next week. There's a webinar coming up next week as well with Digital Twin Consortium, Scottsdale. Anyone in the room can attend anywhere they like around the world. There's a Digital Twin Consortium event in Orlando that I think somehow I'll be at. And we're next meeting on this Queensland, New Zealand front, Richard, on the 6th of July in Auckland, where there's a lot of focus around that airport and all other aspects of transportation, as you will be aware through not just infrastructure but rail and so on. So I guess that to wrap up, as I said, we've gone through a lot of the high level thinking. These are the examples of how as an organisation we want to be contributing meaningfully in terms of action. We invite people to join us, and then I guess I'd throw it open to the room for comments or queries or thoughts or ideas. We've got a few other projects in the wings. One is remote and even regional communities. I mentioned at the beginning of the day about how we could pick up these sorts of principles and enable remote Indigenous communities. And an incredible stat came out the other day. We were talking about smart cities with a couple of people in the US, and something I've been across for a while. There's 9 cities only in the US that have more than 1 million people. There's 19,000 cities in the US. It's an extraordinary, strange spread demographically, and getting more of a focus into those communities is a really, really important initiative for us now. So we know in this country, if you're an Indigenous person, you'll live 34 years less than the national average. You're 200 more times likely to be raped or murdered. There's horrible statistics, but what we do know, if people can stay in their place, and we can provide economic enablement to those communities through selling art. I'm involved in a charity, ATY, Arts and Culture Centre, where in only 4 years, 19 out of the 31 finalists in the Win Art Prize last year were from a community of 2,600 people, where we've been supporting that community over 4 years. So, and then the things going back to people is, like, the levels of diabetes are dropping, the levels of obesity are dropping, people's self-esteem is rising, relationships are lasting, children are not becoming truant. Like, just simple things like this that are utterly transformational to communities are areas of high focus for us. And we talked earlier about how do we enable, not remote but regional communities. In Australia, we're a 13th of America, but there are a lot of cities that have got great resources and good people that can contribute ably, without the concentration of population that we're seeing as assumed. In Istanbul, there's 18.5 million people, and the mayor's saying we've got a plan for 30, and I'm saying how do we get 7 million of them to go back where they came from by enabling those communities? You'll get a lot more value for money than trying to put a subway under the Grand Bazaar. So there are other things coming up. So as I said, I'm very interested to hear at We Are as an organisation, other areas of activity that people perceive to be of high social relevance, and any questions about this. But above all, I'd ask people to join us and be involved in these task forces, which Richard will be overseeing. We have the guy, Doug Migliore, in the US, who's leading the Transportation Hubs project. Digital transformation expert, you've met Kevin McCaffrey out of Galway, who will be helping us with plotting that digital journey. So we've got some of the best and brightest. Sahil will be involved, from one of your colleagues in the University of Melbourne. So there we go.
Can I make one point about the Indigenous? Tragically, a not-for-profit in North Queensland, Indigenous, was hacked recently, which had a big impact on the services. So just the point that it can strike anywhere. And the other vulnerability we haven't talked about is people. So even if you harden every system to its extent, there are people that can be tricked into doing things, phishing campaigns, for example. So very important.
Yeah, there was one case study in the US where a casino lost all its high roller data because someone hacked the tropical fish tank from Malta. If you can believe it, that someone had connected into the central data storing facility. So,
Trying to catch the big fish.
yeah.
What was the question?
Yeah, it's kind of a two-part question about the system when it obviously was airport related. But could that be effectively, and I guess, would it be worthwhile scaling it down to the point where you apply it to something like an inter-island ferry terminal system? I'm conscious that is actually being built right now, and there's future expansion on that.
Absolutely. So what we want to do is templatise it. So, as I said before, in the example of an airport, international, domestic, or both, but there's a cascading series of requirements and obligations under that. If you're a seaport, are you a freight-only seaport, a passenger terminal and freight-only passenger terminal? Am I big, small? Am I hub or medium? Am I hub or am I spoke? Which in the transportation world is really fundamental. If you're at the airport in Denver, you are really just a through point. In Singapore, you're a through point. If you're in Mali in the Maldives, you're an end point, right? So the experiences that you want and the key drivers around that asset vary materially. But what we want is something that can operate from the smallest to the largest scale. So you can pick that up and you can use these tools and templates and enter in all of the information that you have about your ferry terminal. And if it's going from Cape Jervis to Kangaroo Island and a few hundred people a day travel on it, or if it's going from Dover to Calais, you've got a different set of requirements.
And with these systems, is it something that is kept internally? Like I'm talking actually the hardware as well, the system and all the information. Is it more so something that should be recommended to be kept internally, or I see a lot of things, as you mentioned, with cloud. You just get a company that monitors some stuff and they then give you access to that stuff. And I don't think it's being done very well. What is the preference? Is it it's all kept in house or used in the combined approach?
The simple answer is it depends. So if you take banks, for example, there are certain core systems that are still very much on-prem, secured from a cyber perspective, but there are a lot of more efficient processes, and the majority of efficient processes that can be done on the cloud. But it's again designing it to be secured. And even with the best cloud solution, you still got to enter and you still got to exit. Right, so it's about looking at that whole chain. But certainly I wouldn't stop putting something onto a cloud unless it is a particular core system that makes absolutely, it doesn't need to leave the premises, right? If you think about the old big IBM mainframes that run still a lot of the old systems, and it can be contained in one place. And you don't need that, you're only going to take an extract of that and take it somewhere where you don't need to take it off premises. So it's more secure on premises. But to Corey's point, IoT, you can hack a photocopy that nobody even knows is there as your way into somebody's IT system, right? So from an OT system into an IT system by moving, well, as we call it in the industry, by moving laterally. So the first thing you need to start with is an asset register of everything you have, right? Again, fortunately, there's some tools that can do that. We have them. But, you have to look at that whole chain, really, of information. What do you need the information for? How does the information get there? How do you store it? What do you need to do with it? And then look at designing not only the security layer around that, but how to report on that is I would say, the answer.
If I could expand on that a little bit, just as one of the guys who monitors things. So you also have a lot more flexibility these days in different sorts of data that are going to come out of that system. So the ability to take video data and convert it to counts and real data at the edge and say that's the transmitted video data that needs to leave. The ability to say, well, that data then of those counts only needs to get to a system locally, but my management running for the device so that I can do, like I can make sure it's on, I can do software updates, that can get out to the cloud. So there's a lot more granular control of how data moves through these networks. But again, you've got to have security up front before you even start on these things.
And you just used the key word monitor as well. So you do need to actively monitor what's happening.
One of the other things is as network edge expands out, there's a highly competitive marketplace to make sensors and controllers. And when computers were invented, it was about security and integrity of data and then availability. And now you've got these multi-billion-dollar marketplaces with people wanting to get first to market and cheapest to market. And so we're designing solutions around availability first and security and integrity second. So you've got this really nebulous edge to your network, which is why, if you talk about smart cities to cities and governments, there's about three sorts of people you talk to. There's the economic activation people who say yes to everything. There's the IT people who say no to everything. And then there's the people who used to work in electricians or mechanical services or tradespeople who say, I don't know everything. So it's a tricky space, and it comes back to our role as an organisation in that capability and capacity building to help facilitate that, to understand and reduce the risk profile adequately so that citizens can benefit. I said earlier today, we don't want a world where our government just goes and risks all of our taxpayers' money on every new thing that comes along. We want responsible investment and service delivery from government, but we want to temper, I guess, what we would say the inefficiencies of that process or mitigate them to the extent possible, particularly on these sort of transgenerational multi-$100 billion projects that we leave a legacy for our children and beyond to actually have a fair go. At the moment we're creating, one of my kids was at a school, this is probably a good way to wind up, and this is a true story, was around, this is a reasonably exclusive school that we ultimately took them out of, was around at a friend's house playing Monopoly, and her friend, who was about 8, started by putting hotels on Mayfair and Park Lane and owning 2 train stations, right? Because she thought that's how she'd been taught at the start of the game. what we don't want is the opposite of that, where our children start in the world and they're burdened with debt that they can never get out of, whether it's environmental debt, whether it's financial debt, because we're rapidly getting to a point where it's pretty hard to stop. To your point earlier today, so I think we want to be owners of that future opportunity, and again, that's a role that we see as an organisation that's really important, and to create really open and objective discussions. We're not wanting rooms of people who are right, and I think political debate around a lot of this. The idea that in America that you can politicise right to life or the environment or someone's gender is bonkers to me. There's a great quote from one of my university heroes, which is Michel Foucault, who spent a lot of his time schmaltzing around the Sorbonne, as you'd know, Richard. He said, "I'd rather get near to a difficult truth than continually prove it's asylum." And so, again, that's a bit of a mission for us, because a lot of these things, as we've seen today, are incredibly complex, and sometimes it's overwhelming to know where to start. But if we can start with something like airports, if we can start with structural integrity, and you can imagine what a digital twin model like this can do for the structural integrity of the buildings in Turkey. You can know in real time if something's structurally compromised or not. You can map that. You can create hierarchies for demolition and reconstruction. You can find places where people can live while that process is going on, because there's obviously a critically human and environmental process to be managed there. So I'll leave that. We're only 15 minutes over time.
I wanted to link two things you said. You talked about me being from Manchester, and we talked a lot about airports. I can't wait for the solution to be delivered to Manchester Airport. It takes an hour and a half to get through security, and then you can't get a seat to have your food and drink.
That's because it's
roll it on.
It's because it's full of Mancunians. No, we were talking about it yesterday. I was there not long ago, and John down the back there, I think some of you, they're a client of yours. They've actually gamified security. It's fantastic. The lines compete with each other like sheep shearers, and there's 3 KPIs. One is how many bags in a tray. Another one is obviously how many trays they can get through in an hour, and the third one is how much rejection rate they have. But the staff are actually incentivised by how efficiently they deliver on that, and that's something that once you start to have this data and can figure your way through it, you can start even in a rudimentary way like that, build an experience. There was one guy there who had a special vest on because he was the big cheese. What do they used to call him in the shearers then? The person who sheared the most sheep. I'll think of it. He was that guy. He was him, as they say in American sport. All right, thanks everyone for being here again today. If you can and want to join us in Auckland in July, it'll be very cold.
First a beer, and then
A beer. Oh yeah, a beer. Or I don't want to get between people and a beer. Better stop talking.
Where's the
It's not a safe place to be.
Criterion Tavern? Just 500 metres down the road, and then Auckland.
And then all.
Yes.
Great time of the year to be in Auckland, Richard. July.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It'll be shining.
Sun is shining. This spring.
Oh well, it's better than Manchester. Thanks everyone.